Sometimes the desert calls to a man when he's got nowhere left to go. For Silas Dunn, that call came after losing everything that mattered, leaving him with just his old dog Boone and a need to disappear into the endless quiet of the Sonoran wilds. They'd been walking for days when they found that strange saguaro standing alone, its green flesh twisted with a lump that shouldn't have been there. Birds avoided it, and Boone growled low in his throat. But something about that lump pulled at Silas. He drew his knife and cut it open. What spilled out wasn't water or rot, but something much older. A bundle of bones wrapped in ancient cloth, carved with markings that made his blood run cold. What did those mysterious symbols mean? And why did they make the empty desert suddenly feel crowded with whispers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Sonoran desert in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows between the arms of ancient saguaros that had stood sentinel here long before any man had walked this ground. Silas Dunn pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes and adjusted the weight of his pack, feeling the familiar ache in his left shoulder where shrapnel had found its mark 30 years ago, in a jungle half a world away. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of silence broken only by the soft padding of Boone's paws on the sandy trail and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling high above. Boone was getting on in years, 12 now, with grey creeping through his once black coat and a slight stiffness in his hindquarters that reminded Silas of his own advancing age. The Australian cattle dog had been his constant companion since that day 7 years ago, when he'd found the pup abandoned on the side of a Montana highway, barely alive and covered in fleas. Now Boone's dark eyes held the wisdom that comes with seeing the world through loyal devotion, and his instincts had kept them both out of trouble more times than Silas cared to count. They'd been walking south for 3 weeks now, following old mining roads and deer trails that wound through the desert like memories of forgotten journeys. Silas had no particular destination in mind, hadn't for months, really. After Sarah's funeral, after selling the ranch in Montana that had been in his family for 4 generations, after dividing what little money remained between his 2 grown children who lived their busy lives in distant cities, he'd found himself with nothing but time and an old truck loaded with camping gear and a dog who asked for nothing more than his next meal and a warm place to sleep. The truck had given up the ghost outside. Tucson, transmission finally surrendering to the accumulated miles and years of rough country driving. Silas had sold it to a salvage yard for scrap metal prices and used the money to buy supplies, a good sleeping bag, lightweight tent, water purification tablets, and enough dried food to last him through whatever came next. The rest he'd spent on veterinary care for Boone, making sure the old dog was healthy enough for whatever journey lay ahead. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, they'd been walking deeper into the desert, following water sources and shade, avoiding the main roads and the curious eyes of park rangers who might ask too many questions about an old man and his dog living rough in protected wilderness. Silas had learned long ago how to move through country without leaving much of a trail, skills picked up in places where invisibility meant survival. The desert was different from the jungles of Southeast Asia, but the principles remained the same. Respect the land, understand its rhythms, and it would provide what you needed. He'd grown up hearing stories about this country from his grandfather. Old tales passed down from the days when Apache warriors moved through these same canyons like ghosts, leaving no trace except in the memories of those who'd encountered them. His grandfather had been a mining engineer in the 1920s, one of those men who came west seeking fortune in the ground and found instead a deep appreciation for the harsh beauty of the desert landscape. He'd spent his later years collecting stories from old-timers and native peoples, filling journals with accounts of lost mines, hidden springs, and places where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed thinner than elsewhere. Those journals now rested in Silas's pack, yellowed pages filled with his grandfather's careful handwriting describing landmarks and legends. Practical information mixed with folklore, in the way that desert wisdom often blended fact with mystery. Silas had inherited them, along with his grandfather's compass, a desert brass instrument that had guided prospectors and wanderers for nearly a century, and a collection of maps that showed not just topography but the locations of old Indian campsites, abandoned mines, and springs that might still flow after winter rains. The desert had been kind to them so far. They'd found water where the maps promised it would be, shelter in the lee of rock formations during the occasional windstorm, and enough small game to supplement their dried rations. Silas had always been handy with a rifle, and jackrabbits were plentiful if you knew where to look and how to wait. Boone had proven adept at finding desert mice and the occasional rattlesnake, though Silas discouraged the latter pursuit given the dog's age and the remoteness of their location. They'd encountered few other people during their wandering. A pair of backpackers heading north toward Phoenix, a Park Service helicopter making its weekly survey flight, and once, memorably, an elderly Tohono O'odham man gathering saguaro fruit who had studied them both for a long moment before nodding respectfully and continuing on his way. The man had said nothing, but something in his eyes suggested he understood the nature of their journey, not tourism or adventure, but something deeper, a need to lose oneself in vastness until perspective returned or didn't, depending on what the desert decided to reveal. Silas appreciated the solitude. For 62 years, he'd been responsible for other people. First his younger brothers, after their parents died in a car accident when he was 17. Then his squad mates in Vietnam, then Sarah and their children, then the ranch hands and livestock that depended on his decisions for their livelihood. The weight of constant responsibility had shaped him like water shapes stone, slowly but inevitably, until he sometimes felt more like a collection of duties than a man with his own desires and fears. Sarah's death had changed that calculus. 3 years of watching cancer steal her strength one day at a time. 3 years of doctor visits and treatments, and the gradual redefinition of hope, from cure to comfort to simply more time together, had left him exhausted in ways that sleep couldn't address. When she finally passed on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, holding his hand while cardinals sang outside the hospital window, Silas had felt not just grief but a strange kind of relief, not that she was gone, but that the long battle was finally over and she was no longer suffering. The months that followed had been a blur of funeral arrangements, legal paperwork, and well-meaning visitors who brought casseroles and advice about moving forward. His children had suggested he sell the ranch and move to assisted living, worried about their father's isolation and advancing age. His friends encouraged him to stay busy, to find purpose in community activities or volunteer work. Everyone seemed to have opinions about what a 62-year-old widower should do with the remainder of his life. But Silas had discovered something unexpected in those quiet months after the funeral. The absence of responsibility felt not frightening, but liberating. For the first time since adolescence, his days belonged entirely to him. He could eat breakfast at noon or not at all, could spend hours watching clouds move across the sky without feeling guilty about neglected chores, could make decisions based purely on inclination rather than obligation. The realization had led to other realizations. The ranch felt empty without Sarah's laughter echoing through the kitchen, without her garden providing color and purpose to the backyard, without her gentle insistence that certain traditions be maintained and certain standards upheld. His children visited dutifully but awkwardly, their own lives centered in places where their father felt like a visitor rather than family. The community that had once seemed so vital and connected now felt like a collection of aging people, politely marking time until their own exits arrived. So he'd made his choice. Sell everything, divide the proceeds fairly, and walk away from the life he'd built in favor of whatever came next. The decision had shocked his children and friends, but it felt as natural to Silas as breathing. He was done being responsible for anyone except himself and an old dog who asked for nothing but companionship and the occasional scratch behind the ears. Now, 3 weeks into their desert sojourn, he was beginning to understand what his grandfather had tried to tell him in those old stories about the transformative power of wilderness. The desert stripped away pretense and distraction, reduced existence to its essential elements: shelter, water, food, and the vast silence that allowed a man to hear his own thoughts without interference. Each day brought simple challenges: finding shade during the heat, locating the next water source, choosing a campsite that would provide protection from wind and predators that required attention and skill, but carried no weight beyond the immediate moment. Boone had adapted to their nomadic lifestyle with the resilience that had made his breed legendary among ranchers and stockmen. He seemed to understand that this was not a temporary camping trip, but a new way of being, and he approached each day with the alert contentment of a working dog given meaningful tasks. He ranged ahead on the trail, ears pricked for sounds that didn't belong, nose testing the air for scents that might signal danger or opportunity. In camp, he positioned himself where he could observe their surroundings while remaining close enough to provide warning or assistance if needed. The morning they found the strange Saguaro had begun like any other. They'd risen before dawn, shared a breakfast of coffee and dried fruit, and broken camp with the efficient routine they'd developed over weeks of practice. The day promised to be warm, but not oppressively hot, with a thin layer of clouds providing occasional relief from the strengthening sun. They were following a wash that would eventually lead to a series of pools shown on his grandfather's maps, places where winter runoff collected in natural basins carved from solid rock. The Saguaro stood apart from its fellows, isolated on a small rise perhaps 50 yards from the wash. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, perhaps 40 feet tall, with the classic arms that marked it as fully mature, probably well over a century old. But as they drew closer, both man and dog began to sense that something was amiss. The cactus's normally smooth green skin was distorted by a growth near its base, a tumor-like protrusion the size of a watermelon that bulged outward like a clenched fist. Boone's hackles rose as they approached, and he began the low, rumbling growl that usually meant he'd detected something that didn't belong. Silas trusted the dog's instincts completely. In 12 years together, Boone had never been wrong about potential threats. But something about the deformed cactus pulled at Silas despite his companion's warning. A curiosity that felt almost compulsive. Standing before the saguaro, he could see that the growth was not a natural part of the plant structure. The skin around it was discolored, darker than the surrounding flesh, and seemed to pulse with a life of its own. No birds nested in its arms, though other nearby cacti hosted the stick-and-mud constructions of cactus wrens and curve-billed thrashers. Even the normal complement of desert insects seemed absent from its vicinity. Silas drew his knife, a fixed-blade carbon steel tool that had served him faithfully for decades, and approached the mysterious bulge. Boone's growling intensified, but the old dog held his position, torn between his instinct to flee and his loyalty to his human companion. The blade slid easily through the cactus skin, releasing a thin stream of clear fluid that pooled in the sandy soil below. What emerged as the cut widened defied explanation. No water, no pulp, no normal cactus interior. Instead, something carefully wrapped in what appeared to be very old cloth, bound with cord that might once have been leather but had hardened with age into something resembling wire. The bundle was roughly cylindrical, perhaps 18 inches long and 6 inches in diameter, and felt surprisingly heavy when Silas lifted it from the cactus cavity. The cloth wrapping bore markings that made his breath catch in his throat, symbols carved or burned into the fabric in patterns that stirred half-remembered images from his grandfather's journals, illustrations copied from petroglyphs and pottery shards. fragments of a visual language older than any written record. As he held the bundle, the desert around them seemed to change in subtle ways. Shadows grew longer despite the climbing sun. The air grew still in a way that felt expectant rather than peaceful, and somewhere in the distance, he could have sworn he heard voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Boone's growling stopped abruptly, replaced by a whine of confusion and fear that Silas had never heard from the normally confident dog. The old cattleman's hands trembled slightly as he turned the bundle over, studying the strange markings and trying to decide whether to unwrap it here in the open, desert, or carry it to some more sheltered location. One thing was certain: whatever lay hidden within that ancient wrapping had been deliberately concealed, placed inside a living saguaro by someone who understood that the cactus would heal around it, sealing it away from the world for decades or perhaps centuries. And now, through some combination of fate and wandering, Silas Dunn and his faithful dog had become the inheritors of a secret that the desert had kept hidden until this moment. The sun climbed higher, but the shadows around the damaged saguaro seemed reluctant to retreat, clinging to the ground like fingers reluctant to release their grip. Silas carefully wrapped the bundle in his spare shirt and secured it in his pack, feeling its weight settle against his back like a promise or a threat. When he looked up, Boone was watching him with eyes that held questions no dog should have to ask. And in the distance, the desert stretched away toward horizons that suddenly seemed less empty and more watchful than they had just moments before. The weight of the bundle pressed against Silas's back as they continued south through the afternoon heat, its presence seeming to grow heavier with each step rather than becoming familiar. Boone stayed closer than usual, occasionally glancing back at his master with an expression that mixed concern with the kind of alertness that suggested the old dog was expecting trouble from an unexpected direction. They made camp that evening in a shallow cave carved into a red sandstone cliff, a shelter that provided protection from wind and concealment from prying eyes. Silas had learned to choose such places carefully during his weeks in the desert, locations that offered tactical advantages without appearing obviously defensive. Spots where a man could rest without advertising his presence to anyone who might be watching from a distance. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Silas finally allowed himself to examine the bundle more closely. He built a small fire using dead ocotillo branches, arranging the flames so they would provide light without being visible from more than a few dozen yards away. Boone positioned himself at the cave mouth, facing outward toward the desert. His ears pricked for sounds that didn't belong to the natural symphony of evening, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft rustling of kangaroo rats, the almost inaudible whisper of wind through stone. The bundle lay before him on a flat rock, still wrapped in his spare shirt. When he peeled back the fabric, the ancient cloth beneath seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that made the carved symbols appear to move in the dancing flames. The cord that bound it had hardened with age into something that resembled braided metal more than leather, and it took considerable effort with his knife to cut through the bindings without damaging whatever lay within. As the wrapping fell away, Silas found himself looking at something that defied easy categorization. The bones were clearly human. He'd seen enough skeletal remains during his time in Vietnam to recognize the distinctive curve of ribs, the hollow sockets of vertebrae, but they had been arranged in a deliberate pattern and bound together with thin strips of what might have been sinew or plant fiber. Each bone bore intricate carvings, symbols, that seemed to flow from one piece to the next in a continuous narrative that told a story he couldn't begin to decipher. But it was the skull that made his breath catch in his throat. Positioned at the center of the arrangement, it had been carved with such delicate precision that the bone itself seemed to have been transformed into something resembling carved ivory or polished stone. The eye sockets held small crystals that caught the firelight and threw it back in scattered rainbows, while the jaw had been bound shut with silver wire that was somehow untarnished, despite what must have been decades or centuries of burial. Nestled within the ribcage was a leather pouch, the material so old and carefully preserved that it felt like silk beneath his fingers. Inside, he found objects that made his grandfather's stories suddenly seem less like folklore and more like historical record. A collection of small stones carved with symbols, several pieces of what appeared to be ancient pottery bearing similar markings, and a folded piece of hide covered with drawings that depicted landscapes he almost recognized. The hide map, for that's clearly what it was, showed the Sonoran Desert with a level of detail that suggested intimate familiarity with the terrain. Mountain ranges were indicated with careful shading, water sources marked with distinctive symbols, and pathways traced between landmarks in a way that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge. But scattered across the map were additional markings, symbols that matched those carved into the bones, positioned at specific locations throughout the desert landscape. As Silas studied the map by firelight, one location in particular drew his attention. The symbols there were larger and more elaborate than the others, and the surrounding area was depicted with unusual care, a series of canyons and rock formations that he recognized from his grandfather's journals. According to the old man's notes, that particular region had been considered sacred by several different tribes, a place where vision quests were undertaken and where certain ceremonies were performed only by those with the proper knowledge and preparation. Boone's sudden growl interrupted his examination. The dog was staring into the darkness beyond the fire's reach, his body tense with the focused attention that meant he detected something specific rather than simply responding to general unease. Silas carefully rewrapped the bones and slipped the leather pouch into his shirt pocket before moving to join his companion at the cave mouth. The desert night stretched before them, bathed in starlight that turned the landscape into a study in silver and shadow. At first, Silas saw nothing unusual, the familiar silhouettes of saguaros and ocotillo, the distant outline of mountains against the star-filled sky, the normal pattern of shadows and moonlight that he'd grown accustomed to during their weeks of desert travel. Then he heard it. Voices carried on the night wind, speaking in a language that sounded like nothing he'd ever encountered, but somehow stirred memories that felt older than his own experience. The words seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if a conversation was taking place among individuals positioned around their camp in a wide circle. But when he strained his eyes to penetrate the darkness, he could see no sign of human presence. No movement that suggested people were actually there. Boone's growling intensified, but now it carried a note of confusion rather than simple warning. The old dog seemed as puzzled by the voices as his master, unable to locate their source or determine whether they represented a threat that required action. His head moved from side to side as he tried to track sounds that appeared to shift position even as they listened. The conversation, if that's what it was, continued for perhaps 10 minutes, the voices rising and falling in what sounded like ritual chanting, punctuated by individual speakers whose words carried the weight of formal ceremony. Gradually, Silas began to distinguish patterns in the unfamiliar language, repetitions and rhythmic elements that suggested he was overhearing some kind of religious or spiritual observance. As suddenly as they had begun, the voices ceased. The desert returned to its normal nighttime quiet, filled with the small sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But the atmosphere around their camp felt changed, charged with a tension that hadn't been present before the discovery of the bone bundle. Boone remained alert for another hour, scanning the darkness for signs of whatever had spoken in the night, before finally settling into an uneasy sleep. Silas found himself unable to rest. He sat with his back against the cave wall, the rewrapped bundle beside him and his rifle across his knees, watching the night and thinking about the implications of what they'd stumbled across. The bones were clearly very old, the wrapping and binding materials suggesting they'd been hidden for decades at minimum, possibly much longer. The symbols carved into them matched illustrations in his grandfather's journals, drawings copied from petroglyphs found in remote canyons throughout the Southwest. But the voices they'd heard were immediate and contemporary, suggesting that whatever tradition or belief system the bones represented was not simply an artifact of the past, but something that remained active in the present. Someone, or several someones, was still observing the old ceremonies, still speaking the ancient words, still maintaining connections to whatever spiritual or magical practices the bone bundle represented. As dawn approached, Silas made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Instead of continuing their aimless wandering through the desert, they would follow the hide map to the location marked with the elaborate symbols, the place his grandfather had described as sacred ground. Whether driven by curiosity, respect for the dead, or some deeper compulsion he didn't fully understand, he felt obligated to return the bones to whatever ceremonial site they had originally come from. The decision brought with it a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life since Sarah's death. For months, he'd been drifting through days that felt empty of meaning, going through the motions of existence without any clear sense of direction or goal. Now holding the ancient map and feeling the weight of responsibility that came with possessing something clearly sacred to others, he experienced the familiar sensation of having a mission to complete. Boone seemed to sense the change in his master's mood. As they broke camp and prepared to resume their journey, the old dog's demeanor shifted from uneasy vigilance to focused attention. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, guided by a map drawn by hands that had turned to dust long before either of them was born, carrying bones that held secrets older than memory toward a destination that promised answers to questions Silas was only beginning to formulate. The morning sun rose behind them as they set out toward the west, following landmarks indicated on the ancient hide map toward a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds might prove thinner than either man or dog was prepared to discover. Following the hide map proved more challenging than Silas had anticipated. The landmarks depicted with such careful detail centuries ago had been altered by time, weather, and the slow but relentless forces of geological change. Rock formations that had once served as navigation points had shifted or crumbled. Water sources had dried up or changed course, and the subtle pathways marked on the ancient leather had been obscured by decades of flash floods and windstorms. But his grandfather's journals proved invaluable in bridging the gap between past and present. The old mining engineer had spent years correlating native maps and oral histories with modern topographical surveys, creating a kind of translation key that allowed contemporary travelers to interpret ancient directions. Silas found himself consulting both documents frequently, comparing the symbols on the hide map with his grandfather's careful annotations and cross-referencing everything with his brass compass and the worn USGS maps he carried in his pack. By the third day of following the ancient route, a routine had developed. They would rise before dawn and travel during the cooler morning hours, making steady progress toward whatever landmark the map indicated next. During the heat of midday, they would seek shade and rest, allowing both man and dog to recover from the morning's exertion while Silas studied the maps and planned their afternoon route. Late in the day, as temperatures began to drop, they would resume walking until they found a suitable campsite where they could spend the night in relative safety and concealment. The bone bundle remained wrapped and secured in Silas's pack, but its presence seemed to influence everything around them in subtle but unmistakable ways. Wildlife behavior had shifted noticeably since they'd begun carrying the ancient remains. Desert creatures that should have fled at their approach instead watched them pass with an alertness that bordered on intelligence, as if the animals recognized something significant about their cargo. Ravens followed them from a distance, maintaining a respectful but constant surveillance that felt more like an honor guard than casual scavenging behavior. Boone's attitude toward the bundle had evolved from initial fear to wary acceptance. The old dog no longer growled when Silas handled the wrapped bones, but he remained vigilant in ways that suggested he understood they were carrying something that demanded both respect and caution. His normal ranging behavior had changed. Instead of exploring interesting scents or chasing desert mice, he stayed close to his master and kept his attention focused on their surroundings with the intensity of a sentry on dangerous duty. On the fourth morning, they encountered their first clear sign that others were aware of their journey. Silas discovered the arrangement while scouting ahead for their day's route: 3 stones stacked in a careful pyramid beside a distinctive barrel cactus. Positioned exactly where the hide map indicated, they should turn northwest toward a series of canyons. The stones were too precisely placed to be natural, too deliberately positioned to be coincidental, and too fresh to be ancient markers left by the original mapmakers. Someone was watching their progress and leaving signs to confirm they were following the correct path. The realization brought mixed feelings: relief that they weren't lost or misinterpreting the ancient directions, but also unease about the implications of being observed by unknown individuals who apparently had their own interest in the bone bundle's destination. Boone investigated the stone cairn thoroughly, circling it with his nose to the ground and his tail held in the alert position that indicated he'd found something worth noting. When he finished his examination, he looked up at Silas with an expression that seemed to convey information the old rancher wished he could interpret more clearly. The dog had detected scents that meant something, but whether they represented friends or potential threats remained unclear. They continued northwest as the map directed, entering terrain that became increasingly rugged and isolated. The well-worn desert trails gave way to rocky paths that required careful navigation, and the familiar landscape of saguaros and ocotillo was gradually replaced by a more ancient-looking environment of wind-carved stone and hidden canyons. This was country that few modern travelers ever saw, remote enough that even experienced hikers and dedicated wilderness enthusiasts rarely ventured into its maze-like complexity. The hide map's accuracy became even more impressive as they moved deeper into this forgotten landscape. Every major landmark appeared exactly where the ancient cartographer had indicated it would be, despite the centuries that had passed since the original survey. A distinctive arch of red sandstone, a spring hidden in a narrow cleft between towering rock walls, a grove of ancient cottonwoods growing in defiance of the desert. Environment, all were precisely located and clearly marked on the weathered leather, but the map also showed features that no longer existed or had changed beyond recognition. A lake that had presumably been fed by the spring was now just a depression filled with sand and marked by the bleached bones of long-dead trees. A series of pictographs that should have decorated a particular cliff face had been worn away by wind and rain, leaving only faint traces of color that hinted at their former presence. Most significantly, several of the symbols marking sacred sites had been deliberately defaced, scratched out with sharp tools in a way that suggested intentional desecration rather than natural erosion. The evidence of vandalism troubled Silas more than he cared to admit. Someone had made a deliberate effort to destroy or obscure the markers that guided travelers to ceremonial locations, an act that spoke of cultural conflict and disrespect for traditions that had been maintained for generations. He found himself wondering whether they were walking into a situation more complex and potentially dangerous than simple archaeological discovery. As they made camp on the 5th evening, Silas noticed that Boone had begun exhibiting new behaviors that suggested the old dog was responding to stimuli beyond normal sensory perception. The cattle dog would suddenly stop and stare intently at empty air, his head tilted in the listening position, as if hearing sounds that registered below the threshold of human perception. Sometimes he would approach specific rocks or plants and sniff carefully before backing away with what appeared to be respectful caution, as if he'd encountered something that demanded acknowledgement but not interference. That night, the voices returned. But this time, they seemed closer, more immediate, and definitely coming from specific directions rather than surrounding their camp in a diffuse circle. Silas could distinguish at least 3 different speakers, their words carrying clearly on the still desert air, despite being spoken in the same unfamiliar language they'd heard before. The conversation had a different quality than the previous encounter, less ritual chanting and more practical discussion, as if the speakers were coordinating activities or sharing information about current events. One voice in particular caught his attention, not because he could understand the words, but because the speaker's tone conveyed authority and what sounded like mild concern. The other voices responded with what appeared to be reports or updates, brief exchanges that suggested they were part of some kind of organized group with defined roles and responsibilities. When the conversation ended and the desert returned to its normal nighttime quiet, Silas found himself lying awake and thinking about the implications of what he'd overheard. The ancient bone bundle had clearly been hidden for good reason, concealed inside a living saguaro by people who understood that it contained something too important or too dangerous to leave exposed. Now, by following the hide map toward its original resting place, he and Boone had apparently entered the territory of individuals who still maintained connection to whatever traditions the bones represented. Whether those individuals viewed their approach as welcome pilgrimage or dangerous trespass remained to be seen. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Their journey toward the sacred site was being monitored, evaluated, and possibly guided by people who had their own agenda regarding the ancient remains and the knowledge they contained. The 6th morning brought their first direct encounter with the people who had been tracking their progress. Silas discovered her sitting beside their cold campfire when he emerged from the tent at dawn, an elderly Native American woman, perhaps 70 years old, wearing traditional clothing that had been carefully maintained but showed the patina of regular use rather than ceremonial display. She sat with the patient stillness that comes from a lifetime of understanding that some conversations require proper timing and cannot be rushed. Boone had not barked or growled to announce her presence, which told Silas more about her intentions than any words could have conveyed. The old dog lay nearby, alert but relaxed, occasionally glancing between the woman and his master with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting this meeting and approved of its peaceful nature. "You carry old bones," she said without preamble, her English accented but precise. Bones that should have stayed sleeping. Silas settled himself on a rock across the dead fire from her, moving slowly to avoid any gesture that might be interpreted as threatening. "I found them hidden in a saguaro, wrapped in old cloth with symbols I don't understand. Seemed like they belonged somewhere specific." The woman studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes taking in details that most people would miss, the way he held himself, the weathering on his hands that spoke of outdoor work, the respectful distance he maintained without appearing defensive. "My name is Eleanor Yazzie. My grandmother's grandmother was keeper of the old stories. The bones you carry belong to Singing Wolf, a medicine man who died more than 200 years ago. I'm Silas Dunn. This is Boone." He gestured toward the dog, who acknowledged the introduction with a brief tail wag. "I've been following a map that was wrapped with the bones, trying to find where they belong." Elena nodded approvingly. "The map shows the way to Hidden Springs Canyon, where Singing Wolf performed the last of the old ceremonies before the soldiers came and the world changed. But the path is not just about walking from one place to another. There are protocols, preparations that must be observed." She reached into a leather pouch and withdrew several items, a bundle of what appeared to be dried herbs, a small clay pot decorated with symbols that matched those on the hide map, and a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a bird. Singing Wolf was my ancestor. When he knew the old ways were ending, he prepared his own burial bundle and hid it where it would be safe until someone worthy came to complete his journey to the spirit world. "How do you know I'm worthy?" Silas asked. "I'm not Indian," I don't know your traditions or understand the proper ceremonies. Elena smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features and revealing a warmth that had been hidden beneath her formal demeanor. Worthiness is not about blood or knowledge. It is about respect, intention, and willingness to do what is right even when it costs something. You could have sold those bones to collectors, or turned them over to museums, or simply left them where you found them. Instead, you chose to carry them toward home. She stood and moved around the fire circle to examine Silas more closely, her hands tracing symbols in the air above his head in what was clearly some kind of blessing or protective ritual. Your grandfather knew my grandfather. They traded stories and shared maps during the years when the old mining claims were being surveyed. My grandfather spoke of him as a man who understood that some knowledge belongs to the land rather than to the people who walk on it. The revelation that their families had previous connections added another layer of significance to their encounter. Silas thought about his grandfather's journals, the careful notations about water sources and sacred sites, the respectful tone the old man had used when writing about native traditions and beliefs. The mining engineer had apparently understood that he was documenting more than just geographical features he had been preserving, a record of spiritual geography that connected the physical landscape to deeper meanings. There are others who know about the bones, Elena continued. Some want them for the wrong reasons, power, money, or simple curiosity about things they cannot understand. Others believe they should remain hidden forever, that bringing them into the light will cause more harm than good. Both groups have been watching your progress, waiting to see what you would do. She gestured toward the surrounding cliffs, and Silas realized that what he had taken for random variations in the rock face were actually concealed observation posts. People had been monitoring their campsite from multiple directions, probably throughout the night, and he hadn't detected their presence despite his military training and years of wilderness experience. The ones who want to steal the bones will try to take them before you reach Hidden Springs Canyon, Elena said. They believe the symbols contain directions to lost gold mines or hidden treasure. They do not understand that the real treasure is the knowledge of how to maintain balance between the living and the dead. And the ones who want them to stay hidden, they fear what will happen if the old ceremonies are completed. Singing Wolf was powerful, and his spirit has been trapped between worlds for 2 centuries. Some believe that releasing him will bring back the old conflicts, and that the spirits of all the warriors who died fighting for this land will rise up and seek vengeance against those who took it from them. Eleanor opened the clay pot and began mixing its contents with water from her own canteen, creating a thick paste that gave off a sharp medicinal scent. Both groups are wrong. Singing Wolf does not seek vengeance or treasure. He seeks completion, the proper burial rites that will allow his spirit to join his ancestors and find peace. But the ceremony must be performed correctly, with the right preparations and the proper respect. She began applying the paste to Silas's forehead, drawing symbols that matched those carved into the bones. The mixture felt cool against his skin, and seemed to heighten his awareness of his surroundings in subtle but unmistakable ways. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds carried more clearly, and he could sense the presence of the hidden watchers in ways that had nothing to do with normal perception. From this point forward, you are under the protection of the old agreements, Elena said, but you are also committed to completing the journey no matter what obstacles arise. The bones must reach Hidden Springs Canyon before the next new moon, or Singing Wolf's spirit will be lost forever, and the balance that has been maintained for 2 centuries will be broken. Boone rose and approached Elena, allowing her to mark his forehead with the same paste she had used on his master. The old dog accepted the blessing with dignified calm, as if he understood the significance of what was happening and approved of the responsibilities they were accepting. As the morning sun climbed higher, Elena gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. Follow the map, but watch for signs that will guide you when the ancient markers have been destroyed. Trust your dog's instincts. Animals can sense the spirit paths more clearly than humans. And remember that completing this journey will change you in ways you cannot imagine. Some knowledge once gained, it cannot be forgotten or set aside. She disappeared into the rocky maze of canyons with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime moving through difficult terrain without leaving traces. But her words remained with Silas as he and Boone prepared to resume their journey toward Hidden Springs Canyon, carrying not just the bones of a long-dead medicine man, but the weight of obligations that connected them to traditions older than memory and conflicts that had never been fully resolved. The protective symbols Elena had painted on their foreheads proved their worth within hours of her departure. As Silas and Boone navigated a particularly treacherous section of canyon, where the ancient path wound between towering walls of red sandstone, they encountered the first of the treasure hunters who had been tracking their progress. 3 men in expensive outdoor gear emerged from concealment among the rocks ahead, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested military or law enforcement training. The leader, a lean man in his 40s with the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time in desert environments, raised his hand in what might have been a friendly greeting, if not for the rifle slung across his back and the tactical vest that bulged with equipment designed for serious confrontation. "Morning," the man called out, his voice carrying the forced casualness of someone attempting to appear non-threatening while maintaining control of the situation. "Name's Crawford. We're conducting an archaeological survey in this area, and we noticed you've been traveling through some pretty remote country. Mind if we ask what brings you out here?" Silas stopped walking, but kept his hands visible and relaxed, drawing on decades of experience in situations where the wrong move could escalate tension into violence. Boone positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of his master, alert but not aggressive, his body language suggesting readiness without provocation. "Just hiking," Silas replied, matching Crawford's conversational tone while noting the positions of the other 2 men, who had spread out to create a triangular formation that would make it difficult for him and Boone to retreat without exposing their backs. "I've been exploring some of the old mining trails marked on my grandfather's maps," Crawford nodded, as if this explanation satisfied him. But his eyes remained focused on Silas's pack with the intensity of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Your grandfather was a mining engineer, wasn't he? Worked this area back in the 20s and 30s? We've heard there might be some historically significant artifacts in these canyons, Native American items that should probably be turned over to proper authorities for preservation and study." The statement revealed how much the treasure hunters knew about Silas's background and mission, information that could only have been obtained through careful research or surveillance that had begun long before their current encounter. Someone had been planning this confrontation, gathering intelligence about the bone bundle and the people involved in its discovery. "Haven't seen any artifacts," Silas said truthfully, since the bones were wrapped and concealed in his pack rather than openly visible. "Just enjoying the scenery and getting some exercise. Beautiful country out here." One of Crawford's companions, a younger man with the restless energy of someone accustomed to action rather than conversation, shifted position slightly and gestured toward the pack. "Wouldn't mind taking a look at those maps you mentioned. We're always interested in historical documents that might help with our research." The request crossed the line from casual inquiry into obvious attempt at robbery, and Silas felt his muscles tense in preparation for whatever came next. But before he could respond, something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The protective symbols Elena had painted on his and Boone's foreheads began to glow with a faint but unmistakable light, visible even in the bright desert sunshine. The phenomenon lasted only a few seconds, but it was clear that all 5 participants in the standoff had witnessed something that defied normal explanation. Crawford and his companions stepped backward involuntarily, their confident demeanor replaced by uncertainty and what appeared to be genuine fear. The leader's hand moved toward his sidearm before stopping abruptly. as if he'd suddenly remembered that conventional weapons might be ineffective against whatever forces they were confronting. "Jesus Christ," muttered the third treasure hunter, a heavy-set man whose expensive equipment couldn't disguise his fundamental discomfort with wilderness environments. "Did you see that? What the hell was that?" Boone chose that moment to demonstrate his own supernatural awareness, rising to his feet and staring directly at something behind the treasure hunters that only he could perceive. His hackles rose slowly, and he began the low, rumbling growl that indicated the presence of something that didn't belong in the normal world. But this time, his attention was focused not on Silas or the bone bundle, but on invisible presences that seemed to be gathering in response to the threat against their mission. The temperature in the canyon dropped noticeably. Despite the climbing sun and cloudless sky, shadows deepened in ways that defied the angle of light, and the normal sounds of desert life, insects, birds, the whisper of wind through stone, faded into an expectant silence that felt pregnant with potential energy. Crawford was clearly a man, accustomed to controlling situations through intimidation and superior firepower. But the supernatural elements that were manifesting around them fell outside his area of expertise. He looked between Silas and the apparently empty spaces that had captured Boone's attention, trying to process information that challenged his understanding of how the world worked. "You know what?" he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, but lacking its earlier confidence. "Maybe we've got our wires crossed here. Plenty of canyon country to survey. No need for us to crowd you folks." He gestured to his companions, who needed no additional encouragement to begin retreating toward whatever vehicles had brought them to this remote location. But before they withdrew completely, Crawford turned back to Silas with an expression that mixed respect with warning. "Word of advice, friend. There are people interested in this area who aren't as reasonable as we are. Some of them have resources and connections that make problems disappear permanently. You might want to consider whether whatever you're carrying is worth the risk you're taking by staying out here." The threat was delivered in conversational tones, but its implications were clear. The treasure hunters represented just one faction among several groups that were aware of the bone bundle and its significance. Others might prove less susceptible to supernatural deterrence and more willing to use lethal force to obtain what they wanted. As the three men disappeared among the rocks, the supernatural tension that had filled the canyon began to dissipate. The temperature returned to normal, shadows resumed their natural behavior, and the sounds of desert life gradually resumed. But the protective symbols on Silas and Boone's foreheads continued to emit a faint warmth that suggested the spiritual forces Elena had invoked remained active and watchful. Boone relaxed his alert posture, but remained more vigilant than usual as they resumed their journey deeper into the canyon system. The old dog's behavior indicated that the encounter with Crawford's group had been just the beginning of the challenges they would face as they approached Hidden Springs Canyon and the completion of their mission. Silas found himself thinking about Elena's warnings regarding the different factions that were interested in the bones. The treasure hunters clearly believed the burial bundle contained clues to lost wealth, but their quick retreat when confronted with supernatural phenomena suggested they understood. They were dealing with forces beyond their control or comprehension. More concerning was Crawford's reference to other interested parties with greater resources and fewer scruples. People who could make problems disappear permanently represented a level of threat that required careful planning and strategic thinking rather than reliance on spiritual protection alone as they navigated the increasingly complex terrain. Toward their destination, Silas began to formulate contingency plans for dealing with more serious opposition. His military training provided frameworks for tactical thinking, but the supernatural elements of their situation added variables that no amount of conventional preparation could fully address. The bone bundle seemed to grow heavier with each mile they traveled, as if the approaching completion of Singing Wolf's journey was drawing more spiritual energy into the ancient remains. Whatever ceremony awaited them at Hidden Springs Canyon would require all the courage, wisdom, and protection they could muster to complete successfully. The deeper they traveled into the canyon system, the more apparent it became that they were entering territory where the normal rules of the physical world held less authority than the older laws that governed spiritual realms. The hide map's accuracy became almost supernatural in its precision. Every landmark appeared exactly where indicated, despite the passage of centuries and the accumulated effects of weather and geological change. But the landscape itself seemed to be responding to their presence in ways that went beyond coincidence. Water appeared in places where no springs were marked on modern maps, flowing from cracks in the canyon walls that showed no sign of recent moisture. Game trails materialized where none should have existed, leading directly toward their next destination before vanishing once they'd served their purpose. Even the weather seemed to be cooperating with their mission, providing cloud cover during the hottest parts of the day and gentle breezes that carried away the oppressive heat that normally made desert travel. Dangerous Boone's supernatural sensitivity had evolved beyond simple alertness to what appeared to be active communication with invisible presences. The old dog would frequently stop and stare at empty air, his head tilted in the listening position, before changing direction slightly or leading them toward features that weren't visible until they'd approached closely enough to see them clearly. His behavior suggested he was receiving guidance from sources that operated beyond the normal boundaries of canine perception. On their 8th day of following the ancient map, they encountered the second faction Elena had warned them about, the traditionalists who believed the bones should remain hidden forever. Unlike the treasure hunters' crude attempt at intimidation, this group's approach was subtle, persistent, and far more psychologically challenging. The first sign of their presence was the discovery of obstacles that shouldn't have existed. Rock slides that blocked passages, shown as clear on the hide map, flash flood damage in areas where no recent rain had fallen, and equipment failures that occurred with suspicious frequency. Silas's compass began pointing in directions that contradicted both his GPS unit and the visible position of the sun, while his water filter clogged repeatedly despite being cleaned according to manufacturer specifications. The psychological pressure began on the 9th night, when Silas started experiencing dreams that felt more like memories than products of his sleeping mind. He found himself reliving scenes from Singing Wolf's life, ceremonies performed in Hidden Springs Canyon, conflicts with soldiers and settlers who showed no respect for sacred sites, and finally, the medicine man's decision to prepare his own burial bundle and hide it where it would remain safe until the proper time came for its discovery. But the dreams also contained warnings, visions of what would happen if the burial ceremony was completed, spirits of dead warriors rising from the earth, conflicts between the living and the dead that would spread far beyond the desert, and the possibility that completing Singing Wolf's journey might unleash forces that contemporary people were unprepared to handle or control. The dreams were vivid enough that Silas sometimes woke uncertain whether he was a 62-year-old rancher from Montana or a medicine man from another century. The confusion was disorienting and emotionally exhausting, but it also provided insights into the motivations and fears of those who opposed their mission. Boone began exhibiting signs that he was experiencing similar supernatural influences. The old dog would whimper in his sleep, his legs moving as if he were running through landscapes that existed only in vision or memory. During the day, he occasionally responded to commands given in a language Silas didn't recognize, suggesting that both man and dog were being affected by spiritual forces that transcended their normal experience. On the 10th morning, they found a message waiting for them when they emerged from their tent. Symbols had been drawn in the sand around their campsite. Not the protective markings Elena had taught them, but warnings written in the same ancient script that decorated the bone bundle. Silas couldn't read the meaning directly, but the emotional impact was unmistakable. Turn back, Abandon the mission. Leave the dead undisturbed. The message had been created during the night without waking either man or dog. A demonstration of skill that suggested their opponents possessed abilities that went far beyond normal human capabilities. More troubling was the realization that whoever had visited their camp could have easily killed them while they slept, but had chosen instead to deliver a warning that offered one final opportunity to abandon their quest. Throughout that day's travel, they encountered additional signs of opposition from the traditionalist faction. Ancient pictographs that should have provided guidance, according to his grandfather's notes, had been covered with mud that couldn't be washed away, while stone cairns that marked important waypoints had been scattered in patterns that seemed designed to confuse rather than destroy. The interference was sophisticated and targeted, suggesting that their opponents understood both the spiritual significance of their mission and the practical requirements for completing it successfully. But the most challenging aspect of the traditionalists' opposition was its emotional component. As they drew closer to Hidden Springs Canyon, Silas found himself increasingly troubled by doubts about the wisdom of their mission. The dreams had shown him visions of Singing Wolf as a man of great power and deep spiritual knowledge. But they had also revealed the medicine man's capacity for violence when protecting what he considered sacred. What would happen if completing the burial ceremony did restore Singing Wolf's spirit to full power in the contemporary world? The desert had changed dramatically since the medicine man's time, populated by people who had no understanding of the old agreements, managed by government agencies that recognized no authority beyond their own bureaucratic mandates, and exploited by commercial interests that viewed sacred sites as resources to be developed rather than preserved. The weight of responsibility was becoming almost unbearable. Elena had entrusted him with completing a mission that could have consequences far beyond the peaceful resolution of an old spirit's journey to the afterlife. The traditionalists' warnings might represent genuine wisdom rather than simple fear of change, but every time doubt threatened to overwhelm his determination, Silas remembered the moment when he'd first held the bone bundle. The sense of recognition and obligation that had felt deeper than rational thought. Whatever risks completing the mission might entail, abandoning Singing Wolf to another century of spiritual imprisonment felt like a betrayal of trust that would haunt him for the remainder of his own life. Boone seemed to understand his master's internal struggle. The old dog stayed closer than usual, offering the kind of steady companionship that asked nothing but provided the comfort of unconditional loyalty. When Silas faltered or hesitated, Boone would gently guide him toward the correct path, as if the animal possessed clearer understanding of their obligations than the human who was supposed to be leading their expedition. As they made camp on the 10th night, still 2 days away from Hidden Springs Canyon, according to the hide map's indications, Silas made a conscious decision to trust the wisdom that had brought them this far, rather than the fears that threatened to turn them back. Whatever awaited them at the ceremony site, they would face it together, guided by respect for the dead and faith in the spiritual forces that had protected them through challenges no amount of planning could have anticipated. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or supernatural manifestation, but through the quiet discovery of a leather-bound journal hidden beneath a cairn of stones that appeared on his grandfather's hand-drawn map, but not on the ancient hide. Silas found it while seeking shelter from an unexpected afternoon thunderstorm, drawn to investigate the marker by Boone's insistent attention to what had initially appeared to be just another pile of desert rocks. The journal was wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed inside a metal container that had protected it from decades of weather and the occasional flood that swept through the narrow canyon. His grandfather's familiar handwriting filled every page, but these were not the careful geological surveys and mining assessments that Silas remembered from the journals in his pack. This was something far more personal and infinitely more disturbing. June 15th, 1954. The first entry began. The dreams have started again. Singing Wolf calls to me in the old language, showing me visions of what will happen if I complete the ceremony. The government men don't understand what they're asking me to do. They think they're simply requesting archaeological consultation for their atomic testing program. They don't realize they're asking me to help them wake something that has been sleeping for good reason. Silas felt his blood grow cold as he read further. The implications of his grandfather's words, challenging everything he thought he understood about their family history and his current mission. The journal revealed that his grandfather had not been just a mining engineer with an interest in Native American culture, but an active participant in a covert government program that sought to weaponize spiritual forces for military purposes. Atomic Energy Commission believes that detonating nuclear devices near sacred sites will amplify their destructive power through supernatural means, another entry explained. They've recruited me because of my relationships with tribal elders and my knowledge of ceremonial locations. They want me to identify places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds is thinnest, then position their bombs to maximize both conventional and metaphysical damage. The journal documented a moral crisis that had consumed the final years of his grandfather's life. Government officials had pressured him to betray the trust of Native American friends who had shared sacred knowledge, threatening prosecution under the Espionage Act if he refused to cooperate with their research. But as he learned more about the true purpose of their program, he had begun to understand that he was being asked to participate in something that could have catastrophic consequences far beyond the immediate targets of nuclear testing. Singing Wolf's spirit was not hidden. To wait for proper burial, his grandfather had written in an entry dated 3 months before his death. It was sealed away because completing his ceremony would create a spiritual weapon of unimaginable power. The medicine man had discovered how to channel the life force of the desert itself, drawing energy from every living thing within hundreds of miles and focusing it through ritual sacrifice. The government wants to combine this power with atomic weapons to create bombs that destroy not just bodies and buildings, but souls themselves. The journal revealed that his grandfather had ultimately chosen to sabotage the government program by providing false information about ceremonial sites while secretly working with tribal elders to move or hide the most dangerous sacred objects. Singing Wolf's bone bundle had been among the artifacts relocated during this covert preservation effort, concealed inside the Saguaro, not by ancient medicine men, but by his grandfather and a small group of collaborators in the 1950s. The bones contain more than just the remains of a powerful shaman, the final entries explained. Singing Wolf had bound his own life force into the burial bundle, creating what amounts to a spiritual nuclear device that could be triggered by the proper ceremony. The government believes they can control and direct this power, but they're wrong. Completing the ritual wouldn't just restore Singing Wolf's spirit, it would unleash every drop of accumulated spiritual energy that has been building in the desert for the past 2 centuries. Silas set the journal aside and stared out at the storm-darkened canyon, his mind reeling from the implications of what he'd discovered. The mission he'd undertaken, out of respect for the dead, was actually part of a decades-old government conspiracy to develop supernatural weapons. The treasure hunters who had confronted them weren't independent operators seeking lost gold. They were likely working for agencies that still believed the bone bundle could be weaponized for military purposes. Even more troubling was the realization that Elena Yazzie had known the truth about the bone's real purpose. Her warnings about different factions and her insistence on proper protocols suddenly took on new meaning. She hadn't been preparing him to complete a peaceful burial ceremony, but to either safely defuse a spiritual weapon or ensure that it remained under the control of people who understood its true nature. The traditionalists' opposition also made perfect sense in this new context. They weren't simply afraid of change or resistant to Completing old ceremonies, they were trying to prevent the activation of something that could transform the entire Southwest into a zone of supernatural devastation. Their warnings and obstacles had been desperate attempts to stop him from unknowingly triggering a weapon that could kill thousands of people and permanently corrupt the spiritual balance of the region. Boone's behavior throughout their journey took on new significance as well. The old dog's supernatural sensitivity hadn't been responding to benevolent spiritual guides, but to the increasingly dangerous energy that was building around the bone bundle as they approached the activation site. His growing unease and protective instincts had been trying to warn his master about the true nature of what they were carrying. The storm outside intensified, lightning striking the canyon walls with unusual frequency and thunder that seemed to come from underground rather than the sky above. The supernatural forces that had been gathering around their mission were responding to Silas's discovery of the truth, building towards some kind of climactic revelation or confrontation that would determine the ultimate fate of Singing Wolf's spiritual weapon. Reading his grandfather's final entry, dated just days before the old man's death, Silas found instructions that completely changed his understanding of what needed to be done at Hidden Springs Canyon. The ceremony can be performed in two ways. The first, which the government wants and the traditionalists fear, involves binding Singing Wolf's spirit to a living host who can channel and direct its power according to their will. This would create a human weapon of unimaginable capability, but at the cost of the host's humanity and sanity. The second way requires the willing sacrifice of someone with the proper bloodline, someone descended from the families who originally helped hide the bundle. This would release all the accumulated spiritual energy harmlessly back into the desert, restoring the natural balance and allowing Singing Wolf's spirit to find peace. But the person performing this ceremony would not survive the process. I am too old and sick to make this journey myself. But I have hidden instructions where my grandson will find them if he proves worthy of the trust I am placing in him. The choice must be his, made with full knowledge of what it will cost. Some burdens can only be lifted by those willing to carry them to their final destination. Silas closed the journal and looked at Boone, who was watching him with eyes that held an intelligence and understanding that went far beyond normal canine awareness. The old dog had known, perhaps from the beginning, what their journey would ultimately require. The question now was whether Silas possessed the courage and conviction to complete a mission that would save thousands of lives at the cost of his own. The storm began to subside as the sun set behind the canyon walls, but the spiritual tension in the air continued to build. Tomorrow they would reach Hidden Springs Canyon, and Silas would have to choose between becoming a weapon for forces he didn't trust and making the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that Singing Wolf's power was released safely back into the desert where it belonged, in the growing darkness, surrounded by the ancient silence of stone and star. He began to understand that some journeys could only end in one way, and that the courage to accept that ending was perhaps the most important gift a man could offer to the world he would leave behind. The final approach to Hidden Springs Canyon required a pre-dawn departure, following a path so narrow and treacherous that it could only be navigated safely in the cooler temperatures before sunrise. Silas moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that a single misstep could end their mission before they reached its destination, while Boone ranged ahead with heightened alertness that suggested the old dog could sense the approaching culmination of their journey. The landscape around them had taken on an otherworldly quality that went beyond the natural beauty of desert wilderness. Colors seemed more vivid. Shadows held depths that suggested hidden dimensions, and the very air hummed with potential energy that made every breath feel charged with significance. The protective symbols Elena had painted on their foreheads had begun to glow more brightly. providing actual illumination that helped them navigate the treacherous path through darkness. As they climbed higher into the canyon system, following switchbacks that had been carved into solid rock by generations of careful foot traffic, Silas found himself thinking about the choice that awaited him at their destination. The discovery of his grandfather's hidden journal had transformed their mission from simple obligation into moral crisis, forcing him to confront the possibility that doing the right thing might cost him everything he had left to lose. The weight of the bone bundle seemed to have doubled overnight, as if Singing Wolf's spirit was responding to their proximity to the ceremonial site by drawing more energy from its surroundings. Each step required greater effort, and Silas could feel supernatural forces building around them like an approaching thunderstorm that would break when they finally reached Hidden Springs Canyon. Boone's behavior had evolved beyond simple guidance into what appeared to be active communication with invisible presences. The old dog would stop frequently and stare into empty air, his head tilted in the listening position, before making decisions about their route that proved correct, even when they contradicted the apparent evidence of the path ahead. It was clear that spiritual forces were actively helping them reach their destination. But whether those forces had their best interests at heart remained unclear. The first light of dawn revealed that they were not making this final approach alone. Other figures were moving through the canyon system, converging on hidden springs from multiple directions with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Some moved openly along established trails, while others maintained concealment among the rocks and shadows. But all were clearly heading toward the same destination, with purposes that might prove conflicting. Through binoculars borrowed from his grandfather's equipment cache, Silas could identify several distinct groups. Crawford and his treasure hunters were approaching from the east, their movements suggesting they were unaware of the supernatural nature of what they were pursuing, but determined to claim whatever valuable artifacts might be found at the ceremonial site. A larger group of what appeared to be government agents was advancing from the south, their military-style equipment and disciplined formation indicating they represented the continuation of the atomic weapons program his grandfather had tried to sabotage. Most concerning was a third group that seemed to materialize and disappear among the rocks like desert spirits, their presence detectable only through brief glimpses of movement that might have been optical illusions, if not for Boone's consistent reaction to their proximity. These were likely the traditionalists Elena had warned him about, moving through terrain they knew intimately toward a confrontation they had been preparing. For since learning of the bone bundle's discovery, as the sun climbed higher and the canyon walls began to radiate heat that would soon make travel dangerous, Silas realized that timing would be critical to the success of their mission. The ceremonial site could only be approached safely during certain hours, when the angle of sunlight created the proper conditions for the spiritual work that needed to be performed. Arriving too early or too late would make the ceremony impossible to complete. Regardless of which version he chose to attempt, the hide map indicated that Hidden Springs Canyon opened into a circular amphitheater where water emerged from underground sources to create a small oasis, surrounded by towering walls of red sandstone. According to his grandfather's notes, the springs had been considered sacred for centuries before Singing Wolf's time, used by multiple tribes for vision quests and healing ceremonies that required the special energy found only in places where water flowed from deep within the earth. But the journal's final entries had revealed that Singing Wolf had transformed the natural sacred site into something far more powerful and dangerous. Through years of careful ritual work, the medicine man had bound the life force of the entire desert ecosystem to the springs, creating a focal point where unimaginable spiritual energy could be gathered and directed according to his will. The bone bundle was essentially the key that would unlock this accumulated power, either for peaceful release back into the natural world or for weaponization by those who understood how to control it. The choice Silas faced was not simply between personal survival and noble sacrifice, but between two fundamentally different visions of how spiritual power should be used in the contemporary world. Allowing the government agents to claim the bone bundle would give them access to weapons that could be used to enforce their will on anyone who opposed their policies, creating a new form of tyranny that combined military might with supernatural authority. But performing the sacrifice ceremony himself would not guarantee that the released energy would be used wisely or safely. The spiritual forces that had been accumulating for 2 centuries might prove too powerful for the modern world to absorb without catastrophic consequences, triggering environmental disasters or spiritual upheavals that could affect millions of people throughout the Southwest. As they reached the final ridge before descending into Hidden Springs Canyon, Silas paused to consider a third possibility that had begun to form in his mind during the long night of contemplation following his discovery of the journal. Perhaps there was a way to complete the ceremony that would neither unleash uncontrolled spiritual energy nor allow it to be weaponized by government agencies. His grandfather's writings had mentioned that Singing Wolf possessed knowledge of spiritual techniques that went far beyond simple power accumulation and release. The medicine man had understood how to bind energy into specific forms and purposes, creating spiritual tools that could be used for healing, protection, or communication across vast distances. What if the proper ceremony involved not destroying the accumulated power, but transforming it into something that could serve the needs of the desert ecosystem itself? Boone seemed to sense his master's internal deliberation, moving closer and resting his gray muzzle against Silas's leg in a gesture of comfort and support. The old dog's eyes held wisdom that went beyond normal animal intelligence, suggesting that he understood the magnitude of the decision that awaited them in the canyon below. The various groups converging on Hidden Springs were now close enough that their presence could be felt even without direct observation. The air itself seemed charged with tension and conflicting intentions, creating an atmosphere of impending confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Singing Wolf's spiritual weapon, but the future balance between the natural and supernatural worlds. Elena Yazzie emerged from concealment among the rocks ahead, her appearance so sudden and silent that even Boone showed surprise at her proximity. The elderly woman's face was painted with symbols that matched those on the bone bundle, and she carried items that suggested she had come prepared to participate in whatever ceremony was about to take place. "The time has come," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of generations of accumulated responsibility. All the forces that have been building toward this moment are now gathered in one place. What happens in the next few hours will echo through the spiritual realm for centuries to come. She gestured toward the entrance to Hidden Springs Canyon, where morning light was beginning to penetrate the deep shadows that had concealed the sacred site through the night. There are things you need to understand before you enter the ceremonial space. Knowledge that will help you choose wisely when the moment comes to act. But once we begin the descent, there will be no turning back. The spiritual forces that protect this place will not allow anyone to leave until the ceremony is completed, one way or another. Silas adjusted the weight of his pack, feeling the bone bundle settle against his back like a promise of transformation or destruction. Whatever awaited them in Hidden Springs Canyon, he and Boone would face it together, guided by wisdom inherited from his grandfather and sustained by a friendship that had grown stronger through every challenge they had encountered. The sun reached the angle that would illuminate the springs properly, and the 3 unlikely allies began their final descent toward a confrontation that would test everything they believed about the relationship between spiritual power and human responsibility. In the distance, the other groups were also moving toward the canyon entrance, their various purposes about to collide in a space where the normal rules of the physical world held less authority than the ancient laws that governed the realm of spirits and souls. Hidden Springs Canyon opened before them like a cathedral carved from living stone, its circular walls rising 300 feet toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue and distant. At the center of the natural amphitheater, water emerged from a series of underground springs to create pools that reflected the morning light in patterns that moved with their own mysterious rhythm. The sight was breathtaking in its primal beauty, but underneath the visual splendor lay currents of spiritual energy so powerful they made the air itself feel thick and charged with potential. Silas, Elena, and Boone were not the first to arrive. Crawford and his two companions had positioned themselves near the main entrance, their weapons drawn and their attention focused on controlling access to the ceremonial site. The government team had established a perimeter along the western wall, their sophisticated equipment suggesting they were prepared for both conventional combat and supernatural encounters that might require specialized countermeasures. But it was the traditionalists who commanded the space itself. At least a dozen Native American men and women had arranged themselves around the sacred springs in a formation that spoke of ancient protocols and carefully maintained spiritual practices. They were dressed in traditional ceremonial clothing and carried items that clearly belonged to religious observances rather than tourist displays. Eagle feathers, medicine bundles, drums whose surfaces bore symbols that matched those on Singing Wolf's bones. The tension in the canyon was palpable. Multiple groups with conflicting objectives forced into proximity by the convergence of forces that had been building for decades. But before anyone could act on their various agendas, the spiritual dimension of their situation asserted itself in ways that commanded immediate attention from all present. The springs began to glow with light that came from within the water itself, illuminating the pools in shades of blue and green that had no counterpart in normal experience. The walls of the canyon seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and the air filled with sounds that might have been whined through stone, or voices speaking in languages older than human memory. Singing Wolf's bone bundle responded to its proximity to the ceremonial site by generating heat that penetrated through Silas's pack and clothing to warm his back like sunlight focused through a magnifying glass. The protective symbols Elena had painted on his forehead began to glow so brightly they cast visible shadows, marking him as someone who belonged in this sacred space despite his non-native heritage. Elena stepped forward and raised her voice to address everyone present, her words carrying clearly across the canyon despite the supernatural sounds that filled the air. You have all come here seeking to claim power that does not belong to you, but this is a place where the old laws still hold authority, where the spirits of our ancestors determine what happens and who has the right to participate in sacred ceremonies. Crawford's response was predictably aggressive. Lady, I don't know what kind of light show you've got rigged up here, but we're not impressed by special effects. We're here on legitimate archaeological business, and we're not leaving without the artifacts we came to collect. He gestured for his companions to advance toward the springs, but their forward movement was halted abruptly when the ground itself seemed to reject their presence. The stone beneath their feet cracked and shifted, creating barriers that forced them back toward the canyon entrance, while leaving the areas around the traditionalists and Silas completely stable. The government team leader, a woman in military fatigues whose bearing suggested extensive combat experience, approached the situation with more tactical awareness than Crawford's crude intimidation. "Dr. Yazzie," she called out, apparently recognizing Eleanor from previous encounters. "We're here under federal authority to secure potentially dangerous materials that pose a threat to national security. We're prepared to use whatever force is necessary to complete our mission." Eleanor's response carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Your authority means nothing in this place. The spirits who guard hidden springs recognize only those who approach with proper respect and understanding. The bones you seek belong to my ancestor, and they will be returned to him according to the old ceremonies, not your government protocols. The supernatural forces protecting the ceremonial site seemed to respond to the various threats and competing claims by intensifying their manifestations. The light from the springs grew brighter, the sounds in the air became more complex and structured, and the very atmosphere of the canyon took on qualities that made it difficult to breathe normally or think clearly about anything except the immediate spiritual presence that surrounded them. Boone positioned himself beside Silas, his attention focused not on the human conflicts unfolding around them, but on something only he could perceive. The old dog's behavior suggested that Singing Wolf's spirit was beginning to manifest in response to the bone bundle's proximity to its proper resting place, and that the medicine man's consciousness was evaluating the various people present to determine who was worthy of participating in the ceremony that would determine his final fate. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly, and Silas could feel the weight of choice settling on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility that connected him to every person who had ever faced a situation where individual sacrifice might serve a greater good. Whatever happened next would echo through both the physical and spiritual worlds for generations to come. The standoff shattered when Singing Wolf's spirit manifested not as the peaceful ancestor Eleanor had described, but as the warrior shaman his grandfather's journal had revealed him to be. The air above the central spring shimmered and solidified into the translucent form of a man whose presence radiated power that made every person in the canyon step backward involuntarily. The spirit's eyes, ancient, wise, and burning with the accumulated fury of 2 centuries of imprisonment, surveyed the assembled groups with obvious disdain. When his gaze fell on the bone bundle secured to Silas's back, the medicine man's expression shifted to something that might have been relief mixed with grim satisfaction. "Too long have I waited," Singing Wolf spoke, his voice echoing from the canyon walls in multiple languages simultaneously. "Too long have my bones been kept from their proper rest, while the world above forgot the old agreements and abandoned respect for the sacred places." Crawford, to his credit, maintained his aggressive stance despite the obvious supernatural nature of what they were confronting. "Look, spirit or whatever you are, we're here on legitimate business. Those bones are archaeological artifacts that belong in a museum where people can study them properly." Singing Wolf's laughter was like thunder rolling through stone corridors. "Artifacts? You call the vessel of my soul an artifact? You understand nothing of what you seek to possess." The spirit raised his hand, and Crawford's rifle crumbled to rust and dust in seconds, leaving the treasure hunter staring at empty air where his weapon had been. The government team leader proved more adaptable to supernatural circumstances, immediately signaling her troops to fall back to defensive positions while she attempted diplomatic contact. "We represent the United States government. We're here to ensure that any dangerous materials are properly contained and controlled. We're prepared to negotiate for the safe resolution of this situation." "Government," Singing Wolf repeated the word with contempt that transcended language barriers. "The same government that sought to steal my power for their weapons of mass destruction. The same authority that broke every treaty and defiled every sacred site in their quest for dominance over forces they could never comprehend." The spirit's attention turned to the traditionalists, and his expression softened slightly with what might have been approval. "You have maintained the old ways, despite great pressure to abandon them. You have preserved the knowledge and protected the sacred places when others would have sold them for profit or power. But you have also allowed fear to guide your actions, seeking to keep my spirit imprisoned rather than trusting in the wisdom of proper ceremony." Finally, Singing Wolf's gaze settled on Silas, and the intensity of that spiritual examination felt like being evaluated by forces beyond human understanding. "You carry my bones not for profit or power, but because you recognized an obligation that transcends your own interests. You have read your grandfather's words and understood the choice that awaits you. But do you truly comprehend what completion of the ceremony will require?" Silas found his voice despite the overwhelming presence that filled the canyon. I understand that the accumulated spiritual energy needs to be released safely, and that doing so will require a blood sacrifice from someone with the proper lineage. I'm prepared to make that sacrifice if it's the only way to prevent this power from being misused. The medicine man's spirit nodded slowly. Your grandfather was wise to hide the truth until you proved yourself worthy of bearing it. But he did not tell you everything because he hoped there might be another way. There is a third path, one that requires not death but transformation. Not sacrifice but acceptance of responsibility that will last beyond your natural lifetime. Elena stepped forward, her face showing that she had known this possibility existed but had been forbidden to reveal it until Singing Wolf himself chose to offer the alternative. The ceremony can be performed in a way that binds the accumulated energy to a living guardian, someone who accepts the responsibility of protecting and directing spiritual forces for as long as they remain in the physical world. But such a guardian can never return to normal human life. Singing Wolf continued, they become something between mortal and spirit, bound to the sacred places and obligated to serve as protector and teacher for those who seek to understand the old ways. It is a form of immortality, but one that comes with eternal responsibility and isolation from ordinary human experience. Silas felt the weight of this new choice, settling around him like a physical presence. Death in service of releasing the accumulated power safely, or eternal life in service of protecting that power from those who would misuse it. Both options required the abandonment of everything he had planned for the remainder of his natural existence. Boone approached him and sat at his feet, looking up with eyes that held complete trust in whatever decision his master would make. The old dog had followed him through every challenge of their journey, and his presence provided the strength Silas needed to face this final choice with courage rather than fear. The spiritual energy in the canyon continued to build, waiting for resolution that would either dissipate it harmlessly into the desert ecosystem or bind it to purposes that could shape the future of the entire region. Every person present understood that what happened in the next few moments would determine not just Silas's fate, but the balance between spiritual and mundane authority for generations to come. Silas looked down at Boone, whose steady gaze held the wisdom of 12 years together through every challenge life had offered. The old dog had never asked for anything more than companionship and purpose, following his master through the loss of everything familiar toward a destiny neither of them had anticipated. In that moment of profound choice, Silas understood that some decisions could only be made with complete acceptance of their consequences. I accept the responsibility, he said quietly, his words carrying clearly through the charged air of the canyon. But I have one condition. Boone has been my partner in this journey from the beginning. If I'm to become guardian of these sacred places, I want him to share that transformation. We've faced everything together, and I won't abandon him now. Singing Wolf's spirit studied the old cattle dog with the same intensity he had brought to evaluating Silas. After a long moment, the medicine man smiled, the first expression of genuine warmth he had shown since manifesting. Animals often understand the sacred better than humans. Your companion has already been touched by the spirit world through his journey with you. The transformation will strengthen and preserve what is already present within him. The ceremony that followed combined elements of traditions so ancient they preceded recorded history with innovations that Singing Wolf had developed during his lifetime of spiritual exploration. Elena and the other traditionalists provided ritual support, their voices joining in chants that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the canyon walls. Even the government agents and treasure hunters fell silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended their understanding of how the world worked. Silas removed the bone bundle from his pack and placed it beside the central spring, where the wrapping began to dissolve in the supernatural light that filled the canyon. As the ancient cloth fell away, the carved bones rearranged themselves into patterns that pulsed with their own luminescence. creating a mandala of spiritual energy that drew power from every living thing within hundreds of miles. The transformation began gently, warmth spreading through Silas's body as the accumulated spiritual energy of 2 centuries flowed into him in carefully controlled increments. He could feel his perception expanding beyond normal human limits, gaining awareness of the desert ecosystem as a living network of interconnected forces that extended far beyond the boundaries of sight or hearing. Boone's change was equally gradual, but more visibly dramatic. The grey in his coat darkened back to the rich black of his youth, while his movements regained the fluid grace that age had stolen. But his eyes retained the wisdom that comes only through experience, now enhanced by supernatural awareness that would allow him to perceive threats and opportunities across vast distances. As the ceremony reached its climax, Singing Wolf's spirit began to fade, his long imprisonment finally ending as his consciousness merged with the spiritual forces that governed the natural world. "The bonds are transferred," he said, his voice growing fainter with each word. "Guard well what has been entrusted to you. Teach those who come seeking knowledge with proper respect. And remember that true power lies not in dominance over others, but in service to forces greater than any individual will." The medicine man's final words were directed toward Crawford, the government agents, and all who had come seeking to exploit what they found. "Return to your normal lives with this understanding. There are places and powers that exist beyond your authority to claim or control. Respect those boundaries, or face consequences that no earthly force can protect you from." As Singing Wolf's spirit dissipated into the morning air like mist touched by sunlight, the supernatural tension that had filled the canyon began to settle into something more peaceful, but no less powerful. The springs returned to their normal appearance, but the water now carried subtle properties that would promote healing and spiritual insight for those who approached with proper reverence. Crawford and his companions were the first to leave, their earlier confidence replaced by a shaken understanding that they had encountered forces beyond their comprehension or control. The government team followed shortly after, their leader pausing only to nod respectfully toward Elena before withdrawing her forces from territory that clearly lay outside federal jurisdiction. The traditionalists remained longer, sharing knowledge with Silas about the sacred sites throughout the region that would now fall under his protection. Elena provided him with maps and genealogies that would help him identify those who might seek his guidance, along with protocols for maintaining the spiritual balance that kept the desert ecosystem healthy and productive. As the day progressed and the canyon gradually emptied of visitors, Silas found himself alone with Boone beside the sacred springs, beginning to understand the scope of the responsibility he had accepted. He could sense the location of every water source within a 100-mile radius, feel the movement of animals through migration corridors that connected distant mountain ranges, and perceive the subtle damage that development and climate change were inflicting on the intricate web of life that sustained the Sonoran Desert. But alongside the overwhelming awareness of environmental challenges came knowledge of how to address them, where new springs could be encouraged to flow, how wildlife corridors could be protected or restored, and which human activities could be guided toward greater harmony with natural systems. Boone settled beside him as evening approached, the old dog's enhanced senses allowing him to share in the expanded awareness that would guide their work in the years ahead. Together, they watched the desert sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, understanding that they had found not just purpose, but a form of belonging that transcended normal human experience. The bone bundle had crumbled to dust that the evening wind scattered across the sacred springs, carrying Singing Wolf's essence back into the living network of forces he had sought to protect. In accepting the medicine man's spiritual legacy, Silas had discovered that some journeys lead not to destinations, but to transformations that redefine the very nature of existence itself. As night fell over Hidden Springs Canyon, The newest guardians of the ancient ways began their eternal watch over the sacred places, knowing that their sacrifice had preserved not just spiritual traditions, but the delicate balance between human civilization and the natural world that sustains all life.